Leave my property immediately or face the consequences. Margaret Stone burst through the door of my family's mountain cabin, clutching a stack of legal documents and screaming about zoning violations that threatened our generation's-old homestead. When I politely declined her demands, she immediately dialed emergency services, claiming I was a dangerous trespasser. Little did she know, the person taking that call would completely reverse her carefully orchestrated plan. What appeared to be a simple land dispute was about to expose the most shocking conspiracy our county had ever witnessed. My name is Marcus Valley, a 33-year-old former Army Ranger who retired after sustaining injuries to my right leg during overseas deployment. I had recently inherited Pine Ridge Ranch from my grandmother, a stunning 50-acre property nestled beside Mountain Lake in Colorado, featuring a rustic log cabin that served as my temporary residence. This land teaches lessons about perseverance and honor, my grandmother always told me. I thought my peaceful retirement was beginning until I encountered Margaret Stone. The homeowner association, president of the neighboring Alpine Hills estate, a 45-year-old woman with silver hair and the demeanor of someone accustomed to absolute control. The morning chaos erupted started quietly enough. I was inside the cabin repairing one of grandmother's vintage CB radios when my front door flew open without warning. Margaret Stone swept inside as if she owned the property, dressed in an expensive black business suit and designer shoes that clicked sharply against the wooden floors. Her appearance was immaculate, her hair styled perfectly, and her expression could have frozen the lake outside. She carried thick manila folders and a tablet, both of which she slammed onto my grandmother's antique table with enough force to rattle my coffee cup. "Mr. Valley," she declared in a voice that could cut steel, "I am Margaret Stone, president of the Alpine Hills Estate Association, and we have a significant problem. This outdated structure you call home violates our premium community standards and is destroying property values throughout our development. Frankly, it's a disgrace to our entire neighborhood vision." I sipped my coffee and observed her carefully. Something about her outrage seemed performative, as though she was acting for an invisible audience. "Ma'am, respectfully, this building has stood since 1948, and this land has belonged to my family for over 65 years. I'm uncertain what authority your association believes it has over private property outside your development." Margaret's perfectly manicured nails tapped against her tablet screen as she displayed what appeared to be a community petition. Authority. "Mr. Valley, I have 52 signatures from concerned residents and a code violation report filed yesterday." She turned the screen toward me, and I immediately noticed something suspicious. The report's timestamp showed it was filed exactly 24 hours after I had returned to the ranch. This seemed remarkably coincidental for someone claiming to protect long-established community standards. "Interesting timing," I observed, "considering I only arrived here 4 days ago. Were these standards problematic when the cabin was vacant? Or did they suddenly become urgent when someone moved in?" The question seemed to momentarily unsettle her, but she quickly regained her imperious composure. Her face flushed slightly beneath her makeup. "Timing is irrelevant. What matters is that you must vacate this property within 72 hours, or we'll pursue legal action. I'm attempting to be reasonable here, Mr. Valley, but my patience has boundaries." She began pacing through the small cabin like a caged predator, her heels clicking ominously against the floor. I felt the familiar weight of my grandmother's words settling on my shoulders. "Child, this land isn't merely an inheritance, it's a sacred trust. Protecting it means preserving family honor." The pressure to defend our legacy pressed down on me, but I maintained a neutral expression. "Ms. Stone, I appreciate your concern for your community, but this is private property that my family has owned and maintained for decades. I have no intention of leaving." That's when Margaret's facade completely crumbled. Her voice rose to nearly a shriek as she pulled out her phone. "Fine, if you refuse to listen to reason, we'll see how you handle the authorities." Her fingers flew across the screen as she dialed emergency services. "Yes, hello. I need police immediately. There's a dangerous intruder in our community who's refusing to leave and making threats against residents." I almost laughed at the absurdity of being called an intruder on my own property, but something about her tone made me uneasy. There was a rehearsed quality to her hysteria, like she'd practiced this performance. As she continued escalating her story to the emergency operator, describing me as unstable and potentially violent, I remembered something else my grandmother used to say: the loudest voice in the room usually belongs to the most frightened person. Approximately 20 minutes later, a patrol car arrived and Officer Lisa Rodriguez stepped out. I recognized her immediately. The confident stride, the way she assessed the scene before approaching, the professional alertness that never quite leaves military personnel. Lisa was 31, originally from Texas, and had served as a sergeant under my command for 3 years in Afghanistan. Margaret immediately rushed toward her, clearly expecting support from law enforcement. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man has been harassing our community and refusing to leave despite multiple requests. I have documentation of all violations and want him removed immediately." She held up her tablet like it was sacred evidence, her voice dripping with confidence. But Lisa's reaction wasn't what Margaret had anticipated. Instead of focusing on the complaints, she looked directly at me and her expression shifted to something between surprise and respect. "Lieutenant Valley, sir? Is that you?" "Healing. Last I heard, you were still dealing with complications from the injury." The color drained from Margaret's face as she realized her planned power play had taken an unexpected turn. She asked, her voice suddenly much smaller and less certain. Lisa nodded, her professional demeanor softening. "Slightly, ma'am. Lieutenant Valley was my commanding officer in Afghanistan. Carried 3 wounded soldiers out of hostile territory, including myself, when I took shrapnel to the shoulder. Saved our lives." She turned back to me with genuine concern. "Sir, what seems to be the issue here?" I provided Lisa with a factual summary of the situation, maintaining a calm tone. Margaret attempted to interrupt several times, waving her tablet, and mentioning her special connections with the sheriff's department. But Lisa remained focused on gathering facts rather than responding to emotional appeals. After reviewing Margaret's documents and inspecting the property, Lisa concluded that no actual laws had been violated. As Margaret realized her intimidation tactics weren't working, her mask of civilized authority began to crack. "This is far from over, Mr. Valley," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. "You have no understanding of the power that premium community leadership wields in this county. You're going to regret underestimating me." The following morning delivered my first experience of Margaret's systematic warfare approach. My mailbox overflowed with 5 official-looking envelopes, each more threatening than the last. The first was a formal HOA complaint about multiple code violations, complete with professional letterhead and legal terminology that would impress any attorney. The second was an investigation notice from the county planning department regarding unauthorized commercial activity news to me, since I hadn't conducted any business beyond repairing grandmother's old radio. The third envelope nearly made me choke on my coffee. The tax reassessment notice had somehow magically increased my annual property taxes from $750 to $7,800 overnight. The fourth was an emergency environmental inspection notice about potential water contamination scheduled for the following week. The fifth contained a cease and desist order, claiming I was operating an illegal broadcasting station. I spread the documents across my kitchen table and studied them like enemy intelligence reports. Something wasn't right about the timing and coordination of these official actions. It felt too orchestrated, too perfectly synchronized to be coincidental bureaucratic inefficiency. The land reclassification from agricultural to commercial resort development had been filed on March 20th, exactly 3 days after Margaret's first visit to my cabin. Even more suspicious was the property owner's consent signature, which looked remarkably similar to Margaret's flowing script that I'd seen on the HOA document she'd displayed yesterday. I decided to conduct some reconnaissance of my own. First stop was the county assessor's office, where I found Harold Pedersen behind a desk buried in paperwork, perspiring heavily despite the office air conditioning running at maximum capacity. Harold was a quiet man in his early 50s who appeared he'd rather be anywhere else when I walked through his door. His hands trembled slightly when I introduced myself and spread the reassessment notice across his desk. "Mr. Pedersen," I said. Calmly, I'm hoping you can help me understand how my property taxes increased by over 900% in 2 days." His face went pale, and he started shuffling through papers with the frantic energy of someone who knew he'd been caught in something inappropriate. After several minutes of nervous mumbling about standard procedures and routine evaluations, Harold finally broke down and confessed that he'd been pressured into signing fraudulent reassessment documents. The truth poured out like water from a burst dam. Margaret had been blackmailing Harold with photographs of his gambling addiction, threatening to expose his debts to his wife and the county commissioners unless he cooperated with her property value manipulations. She'd been using this leverage to force him into creating fake reassessment documents designed to pressure unwanted neighbors into selling their land. Harold's confession revealed a picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond simple HOA overreach. My next stop was visiting Carmen Gonzalez, a neighbor who lived about a mile down the road in a modest house surrounded by beautiful vegetable gardens. Carmen was a 55-year-old woman who had lived in the area for 30 years, and she possessed the kind of institutional memory that made her invaluable for understanding local politics. She invited me onto her back porch with genuine warmth, offering iced tea and homemade tamales while we discussed the neighborhood's recent history. "Margaret Stone is trouble with a capital T," Carmen told me, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, even though we were alone on her porch. "In the past 4 years, she's orchestrated mysterious misfortunes for 5 different families who refused to sell their land to Stone Development Corporation. There were the Andersons, whose well mysteriously became contaminated immediately after they declined her purchase offer. The Martinez family had their storage barn destroyed in a suspicious fire when they wouldn't sign her development agreement. The elderly Thompson couple suddenly faced a lawsuit about their property boundaries that bankrupted them into selling. The Williams family's septic system mysteriously failed during the county health inspection right after they rejected her offer. And don't get me started on what happened to poor Richard," Carmen added. Carmen's mention of Richard made my ears perk up because that was Margaret's deceased husband, whose name had appeared on several development documents I'd seen. "What exactly happened to Richard?" I asked, and Carmen's expression grew dark and troubled. She explained that Richard had died of a sudden stroke about 18 months ago, but there had been whispers around town about the suspicious timing. Richard had been vocally opposed to his wife's aggressive expansion plans for their development company, preferring to focus on sustainable construction rather than commercial exploitation. "Right after Richard died," Carmen continued, "Margaret fired the environmental consultant he had hired to assess some of her construction projects, and she fast-tracked every permit application that he had been challenging. It was like she couldn't wait to undo everything he'd worked for." Carmen also mentioned that Margaret had been dealing with pressure from the board of directors of Stone Development Corporation, who had been questioning her leadership abilities since her husband's death. Each successful land acquisition had become a way for Margaret to prove to the board that she still possessed the power and influence necessary to run the company. This information was starting to paint a picture of Margaret as someone desperate to maintain control and willing to use increasingly dangerous methods to achieve her goals. The pattern of escalating pressure tactics suggested that she wasn't just a difficult neighbor, but potentially someone who posed a real threat to anyone who stood in her way. The systematic nature of her approach, from legal manipulation to environmental sabotage, indicated a level of planning and coordination that went far beyond simple HOA complaints. As I drove home from Carmen's house, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions, or you'll regret it." The message was followed by a photo of my ranch taken from what looked like the tree line across the lake. Someone had been watching me, and they wanted me to know it. The photograph had been taken with a telephoto lens from considerable distance, which suggested that Margaret's surveillance capabilities were more sophisticated than I had initially assumed. That evening, as I sat in my grandmother's cabin reviewing all the information I'd gathered, I realized I was dealing with something much more serious than a simple property dispute. Margaret Stone wasn't just a demanding HOA. President Shea was the center of a web of corruption and intimidation that had been operating in this county for years. The question was how deep the corruption went and how many people were involved in her operation. Just as I was beginning to process the full scope of what I was up against, I heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, I could see Carmen Gonzalez hurrying up my front steps, her face pale with fear and her hand shaking as she knocked urgently on my door. Carmen practically collapsed into my living room chair, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn fabric bag against her chest. "Marcus, I've been thinking about our conversation all evening, and there's something else you need to know about Richard Stone's death. Something that's been troubling me for 18 months. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she kept glancing toward the windows as if she expected someone to be watching us from the darkness outside. I poured her a glass of water and waited patiently while she gathered her courage. The night Richard died, I was walking my dog around 10:30 p.m. when I saw an ambulance at their house. But here's what never made sense to me. Margaret was standing in their driveway, fully dressed in business clothes, perfectly composed, like she'd been expecting this to happen. Most wives whose husbands just had a sudden stroke would be in their nightgown crying, completely falling apart. Margaret looked like she was dressed for a board meeting. Carmen's observation sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't finished with her revelations. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small manila envelope filled with newspaper clippings and photographs. "I've been collecting information about suspicious deaths in our county for the past few years, ever since my late husband started noticing patterns before he passed. Look at this." She spread several obituaries across my coffee table, each one featuring people who had died suddenly after opposing various development projects throughout the region. The first obituary was for Dr. Sarah Chen, an environmental scientist who had been preparing a report about soil contamination near one of Margaret's proposed development sites. She died in what was ruled a hiking accident, falling from a cliff on a trail she had hiked safely dozens of times before. The second was Frank Williams, an elderly man who had refused to sell his waterfront property to Stone Development Corporation. He died of apparent food poisoning after eating at a restaurant where Margaret had been seen having dinner earlier that same evening. The third was Janet Patterson, county inspector who had been asking uncomfortable questions about permit irregularities. She died in a single-car accident on a straight stretch of road she'd driven daily for 12 years. "Marcus," Carmen said, her voice growing more urgent, "I think Margaret has been systematically eliminating anyone who stands in the way of her business empire. And I think Richard figured out what she was doing. That's why she had to kill him, too." The weight of her accusations hung heavy in the air between us, and I found myself thinking about the sophisticated surveillance equipment that had captured that telephoto image of my ranch earlier today. I decided to do some investigating of my own, starting with Dr. Patricia Wong, the emergency physician who had treated Richard the night he died. Dr. Wong was a 42-year-old woman with intelligent eyes and a serious demeanor who agreed to meet me for coffee at a diner outside of town. She seemed nervous about our meeting, constantly checking her surroundings and speaking in low tones, even though we were sitting in a back booth away from other customers. "Mr. Valley, I've been carrying this burden for almost 2 years now, and I'm honestly relieved that someone is finally asking the right questions." Dr. Wong began, stirring her coffee with shaking hands. Richard Stone's final words before he lost consciousness were Margaret, ... poison, ... evidence in ... single quotes, and then he couldn't speak anymore. His blood work showed elevated levels of warfarin, which is a blood thinner that can be extremely dangerous in the wrong doses. The problem is, Richard was never prescribed warfarin by any physician. Dr. Wong explained that she had tried to report her suspicions to the sheriff's department, but her concerns had been dismissed as speculation without concrete proof. The official cause of death was listed as stroke, which was technically accurate, but it didn't address the underlying cause of why the stroke occurred. I've seen warfarin poisoning before, and Richard's symptoms were textbook. Someone had been giving him that medication without his knowledge, probably over several weeks. My next stop was Dave Morrison, a contractor who had done renovation work at the Stone House the year before Richard died. Dave was a straightforward man in his late 30s who worked with his hands and spoke plainly about what he'd observed. I spent 2 months working on their kitchen and main bathroom, so I got to see how they interacted on a daily basis, he told me as we sat in his truck outside his workshop. Margaret was always very controlling about Richard's medications and supplements. She had this elaborate system of pill organizers and was constantly reminding him to take his vitamins. Dave's observations painted a picture of Margaret as someone who had complete control over her husband's daily routine, including his medication regimen. One thing that struck me as odd was how Margaret would get angry if Richard forgot to take his pills. Like, she was more concerned about his supplement schedule than he was. Most wives nagged their husbands about taking their blood pressure medication, but Margaret was obsessed with these vitamins that she ordered from some specialty pharmacy. But what made Dave's testimony even more compelling was his description of Margaret's emotional state after Richard's death. I went to the funeral, and I'll tell you something that bothered me. Margaret cried during the service. Real tears. Not the fake kind. She genuinely loved that man, but I think she loved money and power more. When he started standing in the way of her business plans, she chose the business over the marriage. It wasn't pure evil. It was worse than that. It was calculated betrayal. This complexity in Margaret's character made her even more dangerous in my mind, because it suggested that she was capable of compartmentalizing her emotions and making cold, logical decisions about eliminating obstacles to her goals. Someone who could murder a spouse they genuinely loved was someone who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a stranger who threatened their plans. As I was driving home from my meeting with Dave, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, but the message was crystal clear. Mr. Valley, you're asking too many questions about things that don't concern you. Richard Stone had an accident because he couldn't mind his own business. Don't make the same mistake he did. The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me with the unsettling certainty that Margaret knew exactly what I was investigating. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow outside my window seemed to hide a potential threat, and every sound made me think of the surveillance photograph that had been taken of my property. As I was double-checking the locks on my doors, I found a black envelope that had been slipped under my front door while I was out. Inside was a single photograph of Richard, Stone's grave marker, and a handwritten note that read, "Some secrets should stay buried." The next morning brought Margaret's most aggressive escalation yet. At precisely 8:30 a.m., Sheriff Dennis Hawthorne pulled into my driveway in his patrol car, accompanied by 2 deputies and an attitude that suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly social call. Sheriff Hawthorne was a man in his late 40s, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of wielding authority without question. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge gleamed in the morning sunlight. His smile had all the warmth of a snake preparing to strike. "Mr. Valley," he said as he approached my front door, "I'm here to discuss some very serious allegations that have been brought to my attention. Margaret Stone has filed formal complaints of harassment, stalking, and threatening behavior, and frankly, these are not charges we take lightly in this county." He held up a manila folder thick with official-looking documents, and I noticed that. His wedding ring caught the light in a way that reminded me of Margaret's expensive jewelry. I invited them inside and offered coffee, maintaining the same calm demeanor that had served me well during countless military briefings, as Sheriff Hawthorne spread the documents across my kitchen table. I began to notice something troubling about his familiarity with the details of my case. He knew specifics about my conversations with Harold Pedersen and my visit to Carmen Gonzalez that suggested he'd been briefed extensively about my activities. More concerning was his casual mention of the situation we've been monitoring for several days now, which revealed that this investigation had been ongoing long before any official complaints had been filed. "Sheriff," I said carefully, "it sounds like you've been aware of this situation for quite some time. Can you help me understand how you knew about my private conversations with county residents before any formal complaints were filed?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, and for just a moment, his professional mask slipped to reveal something much more calculating underneath. Sheriff Hawthorne's recovery was smooth, but not quick enough to hide the fact that he'd revealed more than he intended. "Mr. Valley, this is a small county, and word travels fast when someone starts stirring up trouble in established communities. Margaret Stone is a respected business leader and community advocate, and when she expresses concerns about potential threats, we take those concerns seriously." His explanation sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing it in preparation for this exact question. while Sheriff Hawthorne continued his intimidation routine. I decided to do some research of my own using the laptop computer I kept in my grandmother's cabin. A quick search of public records revealed some interesting connections between Sheriff Hawthorne and Stone Development Corporation. Over the past 3 years, Hawthorne had received campaign contributions totaling over $35,000 from Margaret and various shell companies connected to her business empire. Even more interesting was the fact that Hawthorne's brother-in-law had been awarded several lucrative security contracts for stone development projects. The deeper I dug into the public records, the more obvious it became that Margaret had been systematically building a network of corrupted officials throughout the county government. Property assessors, planning commissioners, environmental inspectors, and law enforcement officials had all received financial benefits from their cooperation with Stone Development Corporation. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its effectiveness. My investigation was interrupted by a phone call from attorney Marcus Kane, a sharp property rights lawyer I'd contacted the previous day for legal advice. Marcus was a man in his early 40s with a reputation for taking on difficult cases and winning against powerful opponents. "Marcus," he said without preamble, "I've been reviewing the documents you sent me, and I think you need to know that there's a federal investigation already underway into corruption in your county government. The FBI has been building a case for months, and your evidence might be exactly what they need to make arrests." Marcus explained that he'd been quietly contacted by federal investigators who were looking into patterns of bribery, fraud, and intimidation connected to several development projects throughout the region. The feds are particularly interested in Margaret Stone because her name keeps appearing in connection with suspicious deaths and unexplained accidents involving people who opposed her business interests. They've been trying to find someone with inside knowledge who would be willing to cooperate with their investigation. This revelation changed everything about my situation. Instead of being an isolated victim fighting against local corruption, I was potentially a key witness in a federal criminal investigation. Marcus arranged for me to meet with FBI agents the following week, but he warned me to be extremely careful. Until then, Margaret Stone is dangerous, and if she suspects that federal authorities are closing in, she might take desperate action to eliminate potential witnesses. That afternoon, Margaret organized what she called an emergency community safety meeting at the Alpine Hills Estate Clubhouse. The meeting was supposedly called to address concerns about my dangerous and erratic behavior, but I suspected it was an attempt to build public support for having me forcibly removed from my property. Through Carmen Gonzalez, I learned that Margaret had been calling residents throughout the day, spreading rumors about my military service and suggesting that I was suffering from untreated PTSD that made me a threat to community safety. The character assassination campaign was remarkably sophisticated, combining just enough truth with carefully crafted lies to create a compelling narrative of danger and instability. Margaret told people about my military background and my early retirement due to injury, but she twisted these facts to suggest that I was a damaged veteran with violent tendencies who couldn't adjust to civilian life. She pointed to my questions about Richard's death as evidence of paranoid delusions and conspiracy theories. What made her campaign even more effective was her use of social media and local news outlets to spread her version of events. By the time the community meeting was scheduled to begin, Margaret had successfully portrayed herself as a concerned citizen trying to protect her neighbors from a potentially dangerous individual. The narrative was compelling enough that even people who had never met me were convinced that I posed a serious threat to their safety and property values as I prepared for what was likely to be a hostile confrontation at the community meeting. I remembered my grandmother's CB radio equipment in the basement. The old radio was still connected to the county emergency services network, which meant I could potentially broadcast evidence of Margaret's crimes to every emergency responder in the region if the situation became desperate enough. That evening, as I was testing the radio equipment and preparing for whatever Margaret had planned, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. The caller ID showed County Emergency Services, but the voice on the other end was completely unexpected. "Mr. Valley, if you want to know the truth about Richard Stone's murder, meet me at the abandoned lumber mill at dawn. Come alone and bring the radio." The voice was female, young, and trembling with fear. Before I could ask any questions, the line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering if I was walking into a trap or finally getting the break I needed to expose Margaret's crimes. I barely slept that night, alternating between excitement about potentially getting concrete evidence and anxiety about walking into what could be an ambush. At 5:30 in the morning, I loaded my grandmother's portable CB radio into my truck and drove through the pre-dawn darkness to the old Rocky Mountain lumber mill that had been abandoned for over a decade. The building was a hulking skeleton of rusted metal and rotting wood, surrounded by overgrown pine trees and the kind of silence that made every footstep sound like a gunshot. A young Asian woman emerged from the shadows near the main building, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had been hiding for a long time. She appeared to be in her early 30s, professionally dressed despite the early hour and remote location, with intelligent eyes that darted constantly toward the access road, as if she expected pursuit at any moment. "Mr. Valley?" she said in the same voice I'd heard on the phone. "I'm Susan Chen, and I was Richard Stone's executive assistant for 2 years. I was also his lover." Susan's revelation hit me like a physical blow, not because of the affair itself, but because of what it implied about her access to information and her motivation for finally coming forward. "I've been hiding since Richard died," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she began to tell her story. "I was supposed to testify at a deposition about some of Margaret's business practices, but Richard died 3 days before my scheduled testimony. That wasn't a coincidence." She led me into the relative shelter of the abandoned mill office, where she'd set up what looked like a temporary command center with laptops, files, and recording equipment. I witnessed Margaret slowly poisoning Richard with warfarin extract that she mixed into his daily vitamin supplements, Susan said, pulling out a small glass vial containing white powder. She bought the warfarin from an underground pharmacy that supplies people who want to commit untraceable murders. I kept samples of the tainted supplements because I knew someday I'd need proof. But Susan's evidence went far beyond the murder weapon. She had been secretly recording conversations using an app on her phone for months before Richard's death, capturing discussions between Margaret and various county officials about bribes, intimidation tactics, and plans to eliminate obstacles to development projects. Richard wasn't just opposed to the resort expansion for environmental reasons, Susan explained as she played audio clips through her laptop speakers. He discovered that the construction site sits on contaminated groundwater from a defunct chemical plant that closed in 1985. Margaret and Sheriff
Althorn
have been covering up EPA reports that would have shut down the entire project. The recordings were damning evidence of a conspiracy that reached into every level of county government. I heard Margaret's voice discussing permanent solutions for property owners who refused to sell. Sheriff Hawthorne confirming that investigations into suspicious deaths would be handled appropriately. And County Commissioner Blake Thompson acknowledging receipt of payments for expedited permit approvals. The scope of the corruption was even more extensive than I had imagined. Susan then revealed the most chilling part of Margaret's plan. "She's arranged for your final accident to happen during tonight's community meeting," Susan said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Sheriff Hawthorne is going to respond to an emergency call about you attacking residents. The shooting will be justified as self-defense. They've already prepared the paperwork and the witness statements." This information sent ice through my veins, but it also clarified my situation completely. I wasn't just fighting a property dispute or even corruption. I was fighting for my life against people who had already committed multiple murders and wouldn't hesitate to add another victim to their list. The community meeting wasn't an opportunity for Margaret to rally support against me. It was going to be the scene of my assassination. That evening, the Alpine Hills Estate Clubhouse was packed with over 90 residents who had been successfully convinced that I posed a clear and present danger to their community. Margaret had done her work well, presenting a fake psychiatric evaluation that claimed I suffered from dangerous PTSD episodes and creating a narrative that portrayed me as an unstable veteran who couldn't adjust to civilian life. The crowd was genuinely frightened and angry, demanding immediate action to protect their families and property values. Margaret stood at the front of the room like a general addressing her troops, wearing a navy blue suit that projected authority and competence. She had charts and graphs showing declining property values, testimonials from concerned residents who claimed to feel unsafe, and official-looking documents that supported her claims about my mental instability. The presentation was polished, professional, and completely fabricated. But it was effective enough to turn the entire community against me. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret announced with practiced sincerity, "Mr. Valley has made it clear that he has no intention of respecting our community standards or our safety concerns. Tonight, we need to make it clear that we will not tolerate threats against our families and our way of life." The crowd erupted in applause. I could see several people pulling out their phones to record what they expected to be my public humiliation and removal. But as Margaret reached the climax of her presentation, something unexpected happened. My grandmother's CB radio, which I had strategically positioned near the back of the room, crackled to life with an emergency broadcast that cut through the crowd noise like a knife. All units. This is FBI Special Agent Sarah Kim. We have multiple arrests in progress at the Alpine Hills Estate Community Meeting. Federal agents are moving to apprehend suspects in a racketeering investigation. The room erupted into chaos as people realized that the evening was not going to proceed according to Margaret's carefully orchestrated plan. Margaret's face went white as she understood that her entire operation was collapsing around her, and Sheriff Hawthorne's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon before he caught himself and realized that resistance would only make his situation worse. In the confusion that followed, I noticed that Susan Chen had quietly entered the back of the room and was recording everything with professional video equipment. It occurred to me that her disappearance in our dawn meeting had been part of an elaborate FBI operation designed to gather final evidence. While keeping her safe from Margaret's retaliation, the chaos in the clubhouse reached a fever pitch as residents began to understand that their community meeting had somehow become the center of a federal investigation. Margaret stood frozen at the front of the room, her perfectly composed facade cracking like ice under pressure as she watched her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse around her. Sheriff Hawthorne had gone pale, his hand hovering near his service weapon, while his eyes darted toward the exits like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. In that moment of confusion and panic, Margaret made the decision that would seal her fate forever. With shaking hands, she pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911, her voice rising to a hysterical shriek that cut through the crowd noise like a siren. "Emergency. Emergency. There's a dangerous veteran with PTSD who's threatening everyone at our community meeting. He's armed and making threats. Send every available unit immediately." Her performance was Oscar-worthy, complete with genuine tears of terror and a voice that cracked with apparent fear. But what Margaret didn't know was that the 911 dispatch system had been rerouted through the county. Emergency Command Center is part of the FBI operation, and the person who answered her frantic call was someone who would change everything about this situation. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice came on the line, strong and authoritative with the unmistakable confidence of a military commander. "This is Chief Robert Thompson, County Emergency Services. Who is the reporting party, and what is the nature of your emergency?" The voice sent electricity through my entire body because I recognized it immediately. Tank Thompson had been my captain in the Army, the officer I'd served under during 2 deployments, and the man whose life I'd saved when I carried him out of an IED blast in Iraq 6 years ago. Margaret, unaware that she was speaking to someone who knew me personally, launched into her rehearsed story about a dangerous veteran who was threatening community members and needed to be removed immediately. "This is Margaret Stone, and there's a man named Marcus Valley who's been harassing our community for weeks. He's mentally unstable, he has PTSD, and he's making violent threats against innocent families. You need to send armed officers immediately before someone gets hurt.